Hello and welcome back again. Today we're going to look at some of the biggest names in philosophy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I'd like to start out, however, with a little run through history to kind of set the stage. When last we left off, we had two big civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, and Greek was developing and all around in the area, as we saw. But things actually changed pretty significantly by the time we get to these guys. So let's take a look at that change real quick. So something to remember. This always throws me to. Keep in mind, in the BC part of history, the numbers go backwards. So 650 is before 600, and 600 is before 550. So as I go on, you'll see the numbers counting down. I always get confused by that, so just keep that in mind. All right, what are we going to look at? Let's go to a map. Let's see what's going on a map here. All right, so here is a map of the Mediterranean area, and let's take a look. To put this in context of what we've talked about before, if you recall, Thales started his school in Miletus, like somewhere around here maybe, and that was in 650 BC. So now, at that time, the big power region in the area was in, you know what, let me do this. Let me create another layer so I can erase that layer. The big power player was sort of in this area right here, and that was the Assyrian Empire. They had been big for a long time. And as I said before, up here was the Lydian Empire. Now, in 609, the Assyrian Empire just suffered a huge collapse. Not going to get into why, but it was very surprising, created a big power vacuum. So let's, come on, there we go. Dang it, little lag. There we go. So they went away. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed, again, 609 BC, they were followed up by the Egyptian Empire here and the Neo-Babylonians. The Babylonians sort of were recurrent, and they both pushed their influence into this area. To put it in some more historical context, the sort of Jewish lands were divided into two nations, northern Israel and then southern was Judea. The Assyrians had captured Israel by this time. At this point, both Egypt and Babylon wanted to know who would Judea side with, and they really kind of dithered back and forth. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar, the leader of the Babylonians, got sick of them dithering and just went in and conquered them. And that led to what we call the Babylonian captivity, where the sort of leaders of the Jewish state were then taken back to Babylon and held in prison. So we got the Neo-Babylonian Empire here. So we got that sort of struggle going on at the time. Also, there was another nation called the Medians, or the Median was like around up in this area right here. They're not as well known. I mean, how impressive was the Median Empire? It was about average. But out of the Medians, one of their client people, the Persians, there came a leader called Cyrus the Great. And in, where is that, 550 BC, Cyrus overthrew the Median Empire. And then from there, they went up and let's do another color. Let's call the Persians, no, not green, that was the Greeks. Let's call the Persians blue. So the Persian homeland was like around there. And they really did. So they came up this way and attacked the Lydian area up there that I talked about. In 546 BC, Sardis, which is a city right around here, fell. And that pretty much opened up the whole area for them. And they extended all of their conquests into here, and this is why it's relevant to our story, also conquered all the way up to the coastland here, including Miletus and those cities. So that's why it's relevant to us. However, as a little side note, they did a couple other things too. For example, in 540 BC, they conquered Babylon. So the Babylonian Empire, or what they call the New Babylonian Empire, fell to the Persians. And then in 525 BC, Cambyses II went in fact, conquered Egypt. So let's just take a second here to realize what happened. I've been playing this up as we had two big civilizations in the area that had been there for thousands of years, Mesopotamian civilizations and Egypt. And they were really the definition of civilizations, and other nations define themselves relative to those. And now we have the Persians conquered both of them, the whole area. And it's sort of extended around there right now. And so they had this whole area here. So really, this was the first big empire, which was like all of known civilization in this map. Yes, they don't have the Greeks yet, but at this point, the Greeks were sort of more just a satellite people, like I was saying. Also, the Persians extended this way into like Afghanistan and northwestern India and such. Which reminds me, there's all those countries out those ways with the stan ending, Pakistan, Afghanistan, says Tajikistan, and so forth. Stan is a Persian word. It's a Persian word that just means place. So that kind of shows you the influence of the Persians in those regions. So this is a big deal. All right, so in about 499 to 493, the Greeks, let's go over to green for Greeks. The Greeks in this area down here started revolting against the current leader of Persia at the time, who was Darius the Great. So there was the Ionian Revolt. And the Greeks of the mainland did help and support. And first the Persians were really getting kicked out until Darius was able to put together an army, come in here, and kick butt. And in 493, in retaliation for this revolt, they crushed Miletus. Miletus was destroyed. All of the people in it sold off to slavery. This was the end of the Milesian school that I've talked about. So 650 BC till up about 493 BC. So that's part of that story. Now, because the Greeks helped, Darius wanted to do a punitive expedition in Greece to punish them. He died before he was able to do it. Or actually, I think he went in there and was defeated at Marathon in his first attempt and pushed out. And so he kept telling himself, I got to remember to go back there and conquer them again. Well, he never got back. But his son, Xerxes, in 480, did, as a second attempt, went in to try to conquer Greece. And that's it's called the Second Persian-Greek War. This is the one we really know a lot more about. Now, at this point, so a couple things to know. The Persian Empire at this time was a huge empire made of a lot of people. So when we talk about the Greeks versus the Persians, it's not like Greek people versus Persian people. It was Greek people versus a huge variety of people from all the lands the Persians had conquered, including other Greeks fighting together. So let's see. Now, they came through, and as they marched through Greece, a lot of Greek city-states decided to defect and go over to their side, and some decided to resist. And they went through, and they were able to burn and pillage a lot of Greek cities. Athens was burned, which leads us to one of my favorite stories in history. I don't know if this really relates to mathematical thought or anything like that, but I've got to tell this because this is my favorite story. So after Athens was burned, the sort of Greek unified fleet of all the Greek city-states came together, and they hid out in this sort of cove area called Salamis. So it's like, this is the land here, and this here's the water, right? And there's water in here. And the Greek fleet hid out in there. If you were out from here, it might look like this was just land. You know, you might not see that there's actually water in there. So that's where they were able to hide. Now, while they were there, all the different city-states were represented. They had their different little fleets, and they were all put together in armada, and they argued over what they were going to do. Well, the representative of Athens, a guy by the name of Themistocles, said, hey, listen, this is where we want to fight them. I mean, look at this. We've got a narrow gap up here, a narrow gap down there. They have a huge fleet. Their ships are bigger than ours. They have more of them. But if they have to come in through this gap, they only come in one at a time, and we could keep knocking them out. And the other said, are you crazy? That they have a huge fleet. There's no way we can beat them. It's insane. And in fact, wasn't your city-state burned down? You're not representing anyone more. Get out of here. So Themistocles left. For the next several days, they debated over what they were going to do. And the final judgment of the committee was that they were going to give up, sort of mainly. surrender, each take their own little fleet back to their home city and sit down. They didn't think that the whole unified fleet could defeat the Persians. So it's not like they were going to defend their cities. They're just going to go back and hope that their cities happen to be one ignored by the Persians, not burned down by the Persians. So a few days later, Themistocles returned, and they said, hey, guess what? This is what we decided while you were gone. We decided that we're just all going to break up, go back to our home city-states, and hope the Persians don't notice us. And Themistocles says, yeah, you could do that. Or you know what? There's a problem. One problem with that. These last few days, I went out and I found Xerxes, and I told him where we were. He said, you did what? And he said, yes, and in fact, they're right outside the strait right now, so we better get going. That's crazy. So Themistocles said, well, now we have to do what I suggested. We got to fight anyway. And they said, but you don't understand. We've dissolved the league. There's nobody in charge. Everyone's just representing their own city-state. We don't have anyone to lead this. And Themistocles says, you know what you need? You need someone that's objective, who isn't representing a city-state because, say, perhaps his city-state was burned to the ground. Someone like me. And they said, well, oh God, if we had any better idea, we would take it. But for right now, we cannot think of any better idea than that. So Themistocles led the Athenians, or not the Athenians, so Themistocles led the whole Greek fleet up against the Persians. Persians, just like he said, they came in this way. They fought the ships one at a time. And not only did it go just like Themistocles hoped, it even went better than he did. As they were sinking Persian ships, eventually it created this like reef of sunken ships that made it even harder for the Persians. The Persians had bigger ships, but they were less maneuverable. The Greek ships were smaller, but more maneuverable. And the entire Persian force, the size of the Persian force was negated through the setup here. And the Greeks won the day and defeated the Persian fleet. So the significance, this was the Battle of Salamis, by the way. The significance of this battle is it cut the supply lines for the Persians on land. A little later, then the unsupplied Persian army in Plataea was defeated. They turned around and went back home. Now, the thing about this is both sides proclaimed victory out of this. So this was a big thing in the history of Western civilization and culture. It was the Persians versus the Greeks, and the Persians were this huge empire, and the Greeks was a small, scrappy force, and they fought off the Persians, and the Persians left, and they survived. Beautiful. And the Persians said, well, this was a punitive expedition to punish the Greeks for the Ionian revolt, and we went in, burned a bunch of their cities, forced the allegiance of others, and then left. So, hey, great war. Both sides were able to claim victory. So that's great. Now, at this point was the founding of the first school of philosophy in Athens. It was founded by a fellow named Anaxagoras of Clazomene. Now, interesting thing about that name, Alexander Clazomene. Clazomene is a city in Ionia, which at that point was clearly Persian. The Ionian revolt was overthrown. It was all Persian again, which means he probably came in as part of the invading force. So what are we to think of here? We're to think the Persians came in, they burned Athens to the ground, and Anaxagoras was looking around after having helped contribute to burning Athens to the ground and saying, you know, this place was really nice before we burned it to the ground, and it's probably going to be really nice again sometime soon. And right now, real estate prices are really reasonable. So I'm going to buy up a plot of land and start a school here, which is what he did. And that was how the tradition of philosophy started in Athens by Anaxagoras with the invasion Persian army after burning down Athens. All right, now, after this, the Greeks were like, well, what if the Persians invade again? What are we going to do? Despite how exactly things happened, people were really impressed with the Athenians and attributed the Athenians to driving off the Persians. They got a lot of credit for it. So they came together and formed what was called the Delian League. And the Delian League was basically the following arrangement. Everyone agreed that the fact that we had all these different city-states and they couldn't really work together that well was to the detriment of the defense. And it was through Themistocles' possible deceit, possible trickery, that unified them together and had them fight off. So they decided, first of all, unity was a good thing. Oh, by the way, things didn't end up well for Themistocles. I mean, somebody that is that brazen and that bold and takes that big a gamble, you know, really lucky once is not going to be lucky again. We're not going to get into that. It didn't end well. But so what they all decided was this. All the city-states were going to take the money that they would spend on their own defense and give it to Athens. And then Athens would create a huge, impressive army and navy and be responsible for defending all of Greece, all of the people that were giving them the money. And that seemed to go great. And then the money just kept rolling in and rolling in. And that's when Athens started building the Parthenon and all of these great buildings. And it was the golden age of Athens. When you think of classical Greece and Athens, this is the era you should think of. Eventually, the city-state said, why exactly are we paying for all of these big building projects in Athens? I mean, that's not what this was for. To which time, whoever was in charge of Athens, maybe Pericles at the time, he was a big Athenian king at the time, or not king, but ruler, said this. So why are you giving us this money? To which the city-states could answer, so that you could have a big army and navy. Where did you get this money from? Well, that was the money we would spend on our army and navy. Okay. So speaking as Athens, what do we have that you don't? A big army and navy. Right. So maybe you should keep the tribute monies rolling in. You know, it would be a real shame if something were to happen to your city-state because, you know, you don't have much defense. Son of a... And thus the Delian League transitioned into the Athenian Empire. And again, like I said, this was the glory days of Athens. This is the big time. Now, some city-states were not happy with the situation, as you can imagine. And so they started building up their own defenses, their own armies, and eventually united under Sparta. And so they decided to revolt against the Athenians. So Sparta led a coalition of city-states against Athens and the city-states that remained true to it. And thus the Greek peninsula broke out in civil war. And this was called the Peloponnesian War. So that area, the peninsula area, is called the Peloponnesians. So that was the Peloponnesian Wars. And they fought back and forth against each other. Persia liked to play each side off against each other. Let's see, who was it? Cyrus was the great. Oh no, Darius was in charge of Persia, and he sent his son Cyrus II in there to keep negotiating and basically keeping the fight going, you know, to both sides, giving money to both sides. And this whole long, protracted war really weakened Greece and really kind of ruined it to an extent, which Persia saw as, hey, a great thing for itself. You know, they just fought Greece. How could a weakened Greece go wrong for Persia? Well, we'll find out in a little bit. So let's see here. Eventually, Sparta and the Spartan League defeated Athens and its league. And Athens was conquered. And this group, I can't remember, there's some numbers, let's see, but the tyrants were put in charge of Athens by Sparta and so forth. And Athens had to come to terms. What just happened? We were on top of the world. Where are we now? How did we get defeated like this? And it was in this time of reconsideration, of sort of refiguring their identity and so forth, that, if you will, the philosophers burst on the stage. Now, remember, there was a philosophical school there going on since Anaxagoras throughout this whole time. But now is when we get the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle deal. All right, so let's start with Socrates. Socrates was a soldier who had fought in the Peloponnesian War. And when he came back, he had an interesting hobby. What he would do is he would go around to people and ask, you know what, I just don't know, what is justice? And someone would start giving him an answer, well, this is what justice is. And he'd be, oh, thank you so much for clarifying that. But one question, though, just one little thing. And then he would follow up with a question. And the person would be like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Well, maybe. And the person would fix it up and say, well, it's like this. And Socrates would, oh, great, wonderful, thank you. You are so smart. But there's just one little nagging thing that bothers me. And they would go back and forth like this. It reminds me, if you've ever seen Peter Falk as Columbo in the old TV series as an investigator. This is his MO. He would go around and say to the suspects, well, what happened here? And the person would tell him what happened. You go, oh, great, thank you. Okay, understood. Except, wait, one little detail. Can you explain this one detail? And they go, oh, yeah, sure. And they would explain how that one detail. He would be like, oh, thank you. completely happy now, completely satisfied. And he'd start walking away and then stop and then turn and go, oh, wait, I just thought of something. On and on and on and on and on until eventually he cracked the case and they arrested the suspects and all of that. That's how Socrates operated in Athens. Now, there's two ways you can see this activity. The way I understand Socrates' activity, sort of the context, is as follows. The original Greek philosophers were what I said were the speculatives, like Thales, who the idea was that wisdom was knowing what was going on, right? Knowing hidden, obscure knowledge, which you could get to through reasoning and such, like everything was made of water, or everything was made of fire, or whatever. So they argued over that, but the idea was that wisdom was knowing what was going on. After them, there came an era of people called the skeptics, who believed that wisdom was avoiding making mistakes, avoiding falsehoods. And instead of saying what they thought was going on, they would poke holes in everyone else's theory. And wisdom was not knowing what was happening, but rather avoiding other people's mistakes. And so doing that. What Socrates did was he merged those two into a single system. What he said was this is the route to wisdom. Is first you speculate. You say, okay, I believe this. And then you turn around and poke holes in that. Say, oh, but here's a problem with that, and here's a problem with that, and here's a problem. And then you speculate again and say, okay, well, here, let me fix the holes. And then you poke holes in that again. Oh, but here's some problems. And by going back and forth between each phase of the process, it's like 2 feet. You're eventually walking towards wisdom, both speculating and knowing stuff, but at the same time, trying to figure out what your mistakes are and avoiding them. And so it was an ongoing process like this. And through this activity, he hoped to teach people that this was the route to wisdom. Okay. Another way of looking at this was that he was just finding pompous know-it-all adults who thought they knew everything and making them look like idiots, or the idiots that they were. This was the opinion of the group of young punks that followed him around and laughed at the people he was talking with. Eventually, this caused problems. Socrates was arrested for corrupting the youth and put on trial, eventually found guilty, sentenced to death, and executed. So that was that. One of those young punks was a guy by the name of Plato. He was really disillusioned with the death of Socrates. This is wrong, man. And so he left and went on travels. That did not necessarily go well for him. He was in a shipwreck. When he was rescued from the shipwreck, he was taken as a slave. And he was sold to a tyrant, Archytas of Tarentum in southern Italy. And Archytas happened to be a Pythagorean. And from Archytas, Plato learned a lot of the Pythagorean stuff. So we've talked about this before. A huge influence of the Pythagoreans on Plato's thought. Eventually, he obtained his freedom, and he returned to Athens, and he started up his own school, the Academy. Okay, so let's take a look at Plato's thoughts. We've talked about some of this before, but I'll go over it again. Plato believed that things are more real or less real, depending on how persistent or changeable they were. A rock was more real than a puff of smoke, and a mountain was more real than a single rock. And therefore, the things that were most real, and therefore most deserving of a philosopher's study, would be the things that never changed at all, abstract objects or concepts or such, like numbers and triangles and so forth. He added to the Pythagorean love of mathematics Socrates' interest in things like justice and truth and beauty, all these things that Socrates was asking people about. So Plato folded that into this collection as not abstract objects, but sort of abstract concepts. He believed that the right way to learn and know about abstract objects or concepts was by proving them using the mathematical method. That led to the problem of how do we know that the definitions are actually describing what they are, or even what they're describing, and that the axioms were true, to which he responded with his reincarnation answer, that we reincarnate, and as we're going from one life to the next, when we're in between lives, we're in what was later called the Platonic heaven, where we could actually experience these abstract things directly. When we're born, we forget about them, but as life goes on, we're continually remembering these things. All right, so that is why he had let no one ignorant of geometry enter up on the front door, because learning geometry and how to do proofs in geometry was a prerequisite for doing philosophy in his academy. All right, so that's Plato. Now what about Aristotle? Okay, Aristotle was a Macedonian. He was from Macedon. That's a territory region just north of Greece. And he was friends with a young prince named Philip. Philip was not like the heir apparent. He was like the third son or something. And Aristotle left to study philosophy at the Academy of Plato. And he did very well. He made a real name for himself, did good. And then all of a sudden, surprise, surprise, somehow Philip became king. And when that happened, he sent word to Aristotle and asked Aristotle to come up and be the tutor for Philip's young son by the name of, what was that name again? Oh, Alexander. Okay, so Aristotle left Athens, went back up to Macedon, and was Alexander's tutor. After he was done with that job, he went back to Athens and started up a school in sort of contradiction to Plato's school, in competition, I should say, with Plato's school. Because Aristotle disagreed with quite a bit of what Plato said. Okay, so what was Aristotle's take? He thought this whole idea that numbers and triangles and stuff, or even truth and justice, was the most real was just ludicrous. I mean, a rock is 1,000 times more real than number or triangle in an abstract sense. That was just crazy. And so Aristotle really was looking at the world around him and what he saw and trying to learn about that. He was the first one who did stuff that we would sort of consider real scientific. He went around and discovered lots of stuff, categorized things, classified them, observations, things like that, real sort of concrete on the earth stuff. And rejecting Plato's whole head in the cloud sort of philosophy. I want to share with you one of my favorite works of art is Raphael's School of Athens. So let's take a look at that. Here it is. So here's a painting made by the Renaissance painter Raphael. And these are all Greek philosophers. I'm sure all of the philosophers we talked about so far are in there somewhere. I just haven't looked up. The main thing to kind of pay attention to is in the middle here. Notice there's a guy with a long beard pointing up, and next to him a guy with a shorter beard sort of pointing straight ahead, or actually is taken to be gesturing towards the ground. The guy on the left is Plato, and he is supposed to be arguing that we should really be paying attention to the heavens and abstraction and all that. And the guy on the right is Aristotle, and he's saying, no, we need to be paying what's going on around us here on earth. That's where real wisdom is. All right, so so let me ask you this then. Stop the share on that. What do you think is more rigorous or more scientific or more right? To be more abstract, to be mathematical, or to be more just concrete and studying what's going on around you? And, rocks, numbers or rocks? Throughout history, people have had different takes on this. This whole debate has resonated throughout the history of Western philosophy. So, for example, Galileo was a little bit more on the mathematical side and theoretical side, and say Newton was a bit more on the observational side and experimental side. All right, now what else? Oh, right. So earlier I said that Socrates had a solution to these xenoparadoxes we talked about earlier. I said they weren't necessarily considered satisfying historically, but let's take a look at what he had to say about that. So first I will remind you of, let's get some omnis out of here. Come on, there we go. First, I'll remind you of one of the paradoxes and then what Socrates' answer to that. So let's take a look at the paradox from Elia, the first one, Elia to Athens. And the idea is this: you can only travel through finitely many points in a finite time. How many points are there between Elia and Athens? And between any 2 points, there's a unique midpoint. So if Zeno wants to travel from Elia to Athens, how many points did he have to travel through to get there? Well, because between any 2 points, there's a midpoint. We know that there must be some midpoint between Elia and Athens. And then there must be midpoints between that and Athens, and midpoints between Elia and that midpoint, and so on and so forth. And we can keep repeating this argument to have as many points as possible. And therefore, there's infinitely many points between Elia and Athens. And since you can only travel through finitely many points in finite time, you can't actually make that journey. So all motion that we see is in fact impossible. It's an illusion. What Socrates said was this. He made a distinction between what he called the potential infinite and the actual infinite. The potential infinite is a process that you can keep repeating forever. I think I keep saying Socrates when I mean Aristotle. I've not talked about Socrates for a long time. Ever since Plato, it's been all Aristotle. Sorry about that. So Aristotle. So a repeated process. We have this repeated process of we can continually find midpoints again and again and again and again. A completed infinite is a fixed completed set, like at the end when we say, therefore, there are infinitely many points between Athens and Elia. What he did was he accepted the notion of a potential infinity of processes that could go on forever, but he rejected the notion of a completed infinity. In order to say you can't get from Athens to Elia, or Elia to Athens, you have to be saying that that there are infinitely many points. And although you can keep saying there's more and more and more and more points, you cannot then, he rules out the step of saying that there are infinitely many points. That's the illegitimate step. So there it is. Okay, what next? Oh, yeah, if you find that answer somewhat unsatisfying, other people did too, we're going to find a much better answer when we take a look at the introduction of the theory of limits at the end of the 19th century. So there's something to hang on for. Okay, well, eventually what happened? Aristotle's old friend Philip eventually ended up conquering Greece. At that point, Aristotle fled Athens because he said he did not want the city to sin twice against philosophy, referring back to when Socrates was put to death. Aristotle thought he might be put to death too. And then eventually, Philip was assassinated, and his young son, Alexander, took over the Macedonian forces in Greece and Macedon and beyond. And as they say, the rest is history, or at least the rest will be the next lecture. The next lecture I'll be talking about, this next video, will be on Alexander the Great and what is called the Hellenistic world. Hope to see you then.